Before we start, I'd like to just take a moment, if you guys would be okay with this, and maybe we could honor the people around the world who don't have access to peace right now, those that are suffering. Some may actually be in this room. Some people may be in our community, certainly around the world. So if you would, just put your feet on the ground for just a moment. And maybe, if you would, maybe put a hand on the heart, a hand on your belly. And we could start by taking a breath together. Just taking a breath in and a breath out. And maybe for the next 10 or 15 seconds, we can send love to the people who are suffering, who don't have access to peace, who are in places of conflict or violence, and send our love to them. Thank you. So I want to give a shout out to the groups that have hosted this. We have the Ada County Medical Society, the Idaho Physician Wellbeing Action Collaborative, Compassionate Communities Healthcare Movement, and St. Luke's Health System. And these are all groups who have a commitment to relationship-based work when it comes to social and cultural change. And many of the efforts in our community have been inspired by John Paul's work. And so that's why we wanted to bring this to you today. In this room, we also have people who are representing different groups in our community, who are having community conversations in all different kinds of ways to be able to see how we can talk with each other and move forward together. And are also very focused on relationship-based work. And then there's some of you that are the more quiet peace builders that are doing the work individually. And those efforts are so important also. So grateful for all of you. So happy that you're all here. I want to acknowledge our pianist who brought some peace to the room. Samuel Bell, and that was really beautiful. Thank you for that work, Samuel. Wonderful. So I'd like to take a couple minutes to introduce John Paul. You guys have seen his bio. Basically, John Paul is a pioneer in the fields of reconciliation, peace building, conflict transformation. And he's worked all around the world in areas with very deep conflicts where maybe there's been violence for centuries. And so he's learned different things about how we can work through those things. And we asked him to come and share some of his ideas today. But I kind of want to share a little bit more personally about this. I met John Paul by going to a conference in 2016. And at the time, maybe similar to the time now, there was a lot of instability in the world. People were feeling pretty unsteady. This was a wonderful conference. It was called Zen Brain, and they brought scientists and philosophers and sociologists and all different people together to talk about how our relationships, how our work in the world affects us. And he came to speak. And there were about 100 of us sitting on the ground on cushions. And he sat in front of the room and he showed us his stories. He told us his stories. He showed us pictures of the people that he's worked with in the different communities. And he showed us pictures of the people that made the difference, people like us, everyday people that had found ways to move through really difficult situations together. And when he finished speaking, which was kind of unusual, we usually would just clap, but the entire room stood up. which is not easy to do from a seated position on a meditation cushion, and probably would be a lot harder for me to do now. And we applauded. And what I remember the most about that moment was the look on his face, because it was a look of surprise. Like, why are you clapping? There was such an expression of such a beautiful humility in that moment. I don't think I'll ever forget that. The other thing that I think about when I think about John Paul's work is that he talked about how he learned from the people on the ground, the people that were enduring the violence. He learned from them how we can move forward. And he listened carefully and then brought different strategies together to share with other people. Another beautiful expression of humility. And finally, I'll say that I didn't know John Paul. I was at the conference. I can't remember, honestly, if I went up and asked a question. I might have. But as we've navigated some of the conflicts in our community and in our world, several of our groups talked about what would it be like if maybe we could have John Paul come and talk to us about his experience and his different approaches. And so I looked on the internet and I found his email, which was surprisingly his personal email. So it was your personal email, which was so crazy to me, right? Sorry, I didn't realize they had put your picture behind me, or I would be looking at you too. And so I emailed him, and the very next day, he wrote back and said, of course, I'd love to help, which was so amazing to me. So I think that's enough words from me. And now that I know you're on the screen there, I want to ask you all to please really warmly welcome John Paul Lederach.
Thank you, Deb. I want to double check before I start the volume and that you can hear me okay. So maybe I can't see people very easily because the camera's a bit distant, but maybe somebody can say or put up a hand and say we're good.
I think it's a little bit muffled, and they said a little louder.
Okay. So is that something I should talk louder, or do you have a volume button on your end?
Perfect. Yeah.
Perfect. If it doesn't wear you out, that sounds great.
Okay, I'm in a, the sun has gone down across our mountains here in Colorado. We had a bit of snow, so I'm well vested because it's cooler, but my office is in kind of a dark room, and I apologize for this darker background, but I'm thrilled to be with you all. I grew up just south of Portland, Oregon, and our family used to travel a lot, heading back east to where my parents' families were at through Idaho. And in fact, Deb, you're speaking of humility. So let me tell you an Idaho humility story before I get started on our more complicated topic tonight. Some years ago, my mom and dad visited a number of their friends that were located in Idaho. And I think in the room there may be a few folks from our Mennonite tradition that are there this evening with you. So they were with some friends, and they were explaining to these friends, and I imagine particularly my mother probably went on at some length about all of the things that I was involved in and doing around the world. And I'm sure it was embellished with a lot of, parental pride included in all of that. And when the conversation concluded, this good friend of our family said, well, you tell John Paul that here in Idaho, we grow potatoes bigger than him. So I can't see your faces to know the reaction, but I imagine that you maybe have heard such a phrase before. But it is really an honor to be with you all this evening. And I know that our topic has its complexities because from what Deb has talked to me about, and of course what I follow with great concern around our country these days as we're heading into this final push on the election season, and the divisions that we've experienced across many of the states and the cities and the places where we live. We often consider ourselves somewhat exempt here in the United States from the difficulties that other places have experienced. But that notion of exceptionalism, I don't think means that we're exempt. We are facing times that have, a considerable amount of challenge and complexity. And my own personal experience is that people are really asking how best to respond to what is happening when division becomes really significant and deep. I think the 2 or 3 biggest emails that I get on a regular basis, one is, are we being drawn back into a situation where this conflict could really go in dangerous directions, even toward a civil war? That's not an unfamiliar question, because that's the kind of context that I've worked with around the globe. And people are often asking, do you see any of the things that you've experienced elsewhere happening here? What do you think? That's a very familiar email. It almost always is followed with the second question, which is, what can I do about it? What is the responsibility, or what are the ideas that, and what can I do about this? So I know that no matter where we live, we have some of these challenges. And this evening, I thought I might start with a very short story of one place that I worked that was traversing a decade-long civil war, which was in a very small country of Nepal, located between China and India. And among the many things that I had opportunity to work with across nearly 15 years of traveling and engaging with people, and Deb was correct to say that a lot of my work has been with what we might call everyday folks, people in local communities that are the ones that were often most impacted by the violence in a setting that does have open civil war. Though I've also worked in Nepal and at other locations at the highest political level. And it's always interesting to move between the difficulties of what's happening in the public sphere and what's happening for people in their everyday lives. This particular story is about a good friend of mine whose name is Baluji, as we used to call him. And Baluji was a young man who was a member of a group that's known in Nepal as the Mukta Kamaya. The Mukta Kamaya, or the phrase is used to name a particular phenomenon more than an ethnic group. It is about people who were held for multiple generations in a form of modern day slavery, or bonded laborers, as they would call them. Basically, the amount of pay they would be given could not fully cover their food and housing where they were working. So they had to repeat cycles of going back to work, and were never able to leave over, in this case, generations. Balu was born, I think, into the 3rd generation of a bonded labor situation. The Constitution of Nepal, at a given point, made the case as enshrined law that this form of bonded labor was no longer legal and that people should be released. His personal story is that he was approximately age 18 when his whole community left one night into freedom, though it was raining and they only had what they could carry on their backs. And it was precisely in this phase that was leading into the Civil War. And so if you are a whole community and you're leaving where you have lived and worked, you have this extraordinary experience of freedom, but you also have this deeply challenging question of where will you live and how will you make it? And he recalled that with us quite a number of times because in that southern part of Nepal, where you needed to go to survive was that you had to be close to a forest, primarily because you needed wood to cook, and you had to be near a river because you needed water. And you had no legal titles, so a community would come and locate themselves near a forest and near a river. And in Nepal, there is this other interesting phenomena, which is that local communities have what they refer to as community user groups. And a community user group is a community that understands their responsibility to protect the forest. And there are sometimes water user groups, which are, they're protecting the riverways and the access to water they have. And those groups are often made up of very diverse people who cohabit those areas, even though the distinguishing caste structure often impacts this. So when Balu and his community arrive, they are considered to be encroachers. And they come almost automatically into conflict with the other local communities that are in that area. Balu was such an interesting person because as a young man, he was one of the few people from his community that spoke multiple languages and could navigate across the different language groups that were in the area where they had located. And so he found a way to gain membership in the local forest user group. And the work that we were doing over that period of more than a decade was to find ways for people who were enmeshed in long-standing land, forest, and water access conflicts, what you might call natural resource conflicts, where a civil war is happening, so weapons are always available, and where the national government is paralyzed given the war setting, and there is very little recourse for responding to local situations of these conflicts. And our effort was to work with the forest user groups and the Mukta Kamaya to develop a new approach to how these very volatile and often violent conflicts could be responded to differently. Partway into our process, because we did not come with a predetermined approach, we were using an approach that said, people who are closest to these locations, to their communities, have the best and deepest understanding of the relationships and the repeating dynamics. And together, we have to devise something that works well for the context that they're in. That was basically our approach to this. And that required us, among other things, to develop these small teams of 2 or 3, 4 people who would actually travel out, each of them from a different part of the community, to spend time talking to each of the groups that were in these conflicts, and then to come back and go back around again and go back around again. And they referred to themselves, because we did a very careful study of how spiders make webs, and there are extraordinary webs in the forests of Nepal. This idea that the spider has this movement that goes from the center out to the periphery, moves around the circle, and then comes back and begins to create the radii that connect groups back and forth. This constant movement was part of what they were doing. About the second year in, and hear the gist of my story, Balu came to one of our, we would have these week-long retreats where people would come back from what they were learning and share the challenges that they were facing. And he came at one point and said, I don't know who I am. And of course, that seems like a rather odd question to pose to a group, but it was not only relevant, but his way of explaining it was extraordinary. Because he said, what I'm facing all the time is that when I'm with my group, the Mukta Kamaya, they tell me, Balu, you have to be on our side and you have to defend us to that forest user group because they're trying to kick us away from the river and the forest. And when I am with my friends from the forest user group, they say, Balu, you are one of us. You have to defend us against those people. And he said, I don't know which side I'm supposed to be on. I'm Mukta Kamaya, but I'm also have these significant relationships with the forest user group, which leads me to the question, who am I? And in the course of all the work we were doing, we referred to that discussion, which lasted quite a long while, and we kept coming back to it. We referred to that discussion as Balu's dilemma. Balu's dilemma. And the dilemma was, at essence, the question of how do you lead when you find yourself caught in the midst of really deep and toxic polarization. And what they began to devise was, at essence, an approach that said, it will take time. The key to change is the quality of our relationships. And we need to learn to listen together differently. And out of that, they have developed a whole process in which they do not go to or request external, professional, outside mediation or facilitation, but the people who are actually participants in what can be sometimes decade-long conflicts that always are at the edge of violence. They have devised a process that permits them to improve relationships while addressing the deeper issues that are emergent in each of these conflicts. As I speak now, nearly 20 years since we started this, they have been able to transform almost 300 land and forest-based conflicts across the southern part and the western part of Nepal. Why this starting point? I think we face Balu's dilemma. And I'd like to talk for the few minutes that I have about how we might better understand the dynamics and the push and pull of toxic polarization. And circle back to the question that I'm getting a lot these days, what can I do? And leave you with a couple of thoughts. And then with Deb, we discussed the possibility that you all would have opportunity at your tables to talk about what you just heard me say, what things stuck with you, what things resonated, and what questions you might have. And I plan to stay around long enough to have a bit of conversation, though I think we understand this as kind of an ongoing process that you all have. So let me start with the idea of toxic polarization. I think polarization is pretty normal. This idea that we are part of groups that make a difference in our lives, that we have identities. Many of us, I think all of us, in one form or another, carry multiple forms of identity. Whether that's race, language, background, education, whether I'm a parent and now a grandparent. This is a new kind of identity in so many ways that you learn yourself into. Our professions. We have all of these ways that our identities cross-cut, and we form part of groups that share part of that identity. When conflict and polarization begin to intensify and become what I would refer to as more toxic, what we find is that we begin to narrow our identities to nearly a singular way of understanding Balu's question, who am I? And we know that polarization generally, as it intensifies, creates a couple of very typical dynamics. So when you find yourself in a conflict with someone else, perhaps at work or at home, in the family or in the neighborhood, wherever it may be, you feel this kind of push that does almost simultaneously two or three things. One is how it impacts and changes me personally. And all of us are different, so we all have individual changes that we may be experiencing. We may find it harder to speak about things we care about. We may find it the opposite. Some people need to talk a lot about it, and that sometimes can drive others, to have more distance. We find that our relationships begin to pull apart. In fact, the most common dynamic that we experience with polarization as it intensifies is this pull into kind of like bubbles or groups where our communication patterns shift. So just to take note of what those patterns might be, we talk more within our group about the other group. We talk about them, but we don't talk with them. We have less and less contact. The makeup of our groups are often people who agree. So we have increased communication among those of us that agree and less direct communication with others. And in that process, we have to, in essence, assume by secondary sources or tertiary sources, third-hand information, what those people might be thinking. And we notice our language begins to shift toward ways in which we see us, we see them, that we experience threat, and that we don't understand why they don't understand us. These things all become quite prevalent. Among the hardest things that we experience, and I think this is what Baluji was speaking to, those that may have relationships that cut across this division, those that have relationships where they do have contact because of where they work or where they travel or where their kids go to school, feel the push and pull to declare themselves for one or another group. And sometimes there are multiple groups rather than just two. These are fairly common dynamics. When it becomes toxic, what it does is it begins to poison. It's a notion of toxicity. It begins to poison the body, the health of our social body, of our, if you will, the body politic. And that begins to affect almost everything that we do. Now, within that, you'll notice that it becomes so powerful that we do what I refer to as listening with our eyes. So in a really toxic polarization, in a deep and more intensified polarization, listening with your eyes means that for a sense of safety, whenever somebody speaks, you are looking first to see who they are with. in order to know what association that is, to do what? In order to know how you should take care with or judge the quality of what they might be saying. So listening with your eyes means that you move, and you will often say, for the purpose of not being fooled or hurt. You listen to see who's speaking before you listen more deeply into what they might be saying. And that creates increasingly a vacuum of curiosity. We assume we know what they're doing and what they think and what they're proposing before we've even had a capacity for interaction. Now, those are fairly common dilemmas. I would imagine because you all are gathering with primarily a connection in one form or another to our healthcare system. Your daily experience is also around how views and issues, the content of policy and approaches, have been impacted by differences of views that exist as our polarization across differences that we have politically and culturally begin to impact the actual quality of our interactions on a daily basis where we live and work. Now, this leads me to a final small piece on polarization before I go to that second question, which is when polarization begins to function as a system. That is, that those dynamics are happening and they are happening on a regular basis. We can ask ourselves this very interesting question, which comes from the standpoint not of asking who's right or wrong, or what's right or wrong at the level of policy or content. We can ask ourselves the question, what's the pattern that's happening? And what do those patterns produce over and over again? And I think they produce two things. And one of the places I saw this most recently was in a similar conversation, but with a set of people who were journalists, newspaper, TV, connected to a variety of ways to bring people information about what's happening, locally and across our nation. And they said to me that their language that they're experiencing in their newsrooms is that they are either frozen or fried. Frozen or fried. And that actually, I think, gets close to the two things that I think toxic polarization produces. And would suggest that this evening you give some thought to whether you think this is what is produced and how you have observed it or experienced it. So the first thing I think a system of polarization does is it produces paralysis, frozen. People feel fearful, not knowing what quite to say or do for the fear that it will boomerang back on them. We do what? We pull back and away. One of the most famous Irish poets, speaking to the conflict in Northern Ireland, had this extraordinary little phrase in which he said, "Whatever you say nothing." Whatever you say nothing. Why would he say that? Because in the Northern Ireland context, even if you're in a group like this and you give your name to the table and you say John or Sean, those words, your name, already put you in a Catholic or Protestant community, even if you yourself have navigated far beyond that. You will be judged by the accent that you have. You will be judged by where your home may have been when you were born. You will be judged by any phrase that you say. So Seamus Heaney, this famous poet, said, whatever you say nothing. It's the fear. It's the paralysis. What you experience from really toxic polarization is pulling back to stay safe. And our areas of safety tend to get smaller and smaller and smaller. The second thing I think that toxic polarization produces is that the system lives to replicate itself. That is, it replicates itself over and over again. And the way that it does this is that idea of fried, what our journalist friends called frozen. That's don't say anything, pull back. Or if you do step in, it's you're going to get fried. You're not going to be understood, and you're going to contribute even though you didn't mean to. You're going to be seen as contributing to something that creates a reaction back because they're not actually listening that carefully to where it is that it might be coming from. And you will find yourself defensive, and then you go back and forth. And we sociologists actually have a term for this. We call it reciprocal causation. Reciprocal causation. That the cause of the conflict are not the originating issues that you may want to talk about. They are the reactions to the reactions to the reactions. A system of toxicity lives to reproduce itself. And what it creates to a large degree is fear and paralysis, pulling back towards safety. Now, in places that I've worked, this comes coupled with us and them moving increasingly to forms of dehumanizing the other, of believing that the other is such a threat because we've experienced it, that they are not, in fact. Trustworthy is not the beginning word. They're not worthy of believing, and they are, in fact, less than we are, less than human because of what we've experienced from them. And that pathway that leads from polarization through dehumanization is often the justification of violence. We need to respond because if we don't, we will not survive. So the language of survival becomes all gripping and all powerful. Now that's in the extreme form. What I want to come back to is, I think we've got enormous potential to work in ways that can engage these patterns and transform them. To not let them define us, the patterns, but for us to redefine the ways that we commit, to redefine the ways that we commit to the habits of humanization and the engagement that permits us to understand that we can be not only good people and good neighbors, but we can do so on the basis of being deeply different. That in essence, it is possible to live with deep difference and not have to fall to the patterns of toxicity and deep violence and deep separation. And that, by my view, while we might expect that that form of leadership comes from the highest levels, I think the greatest promise is the proximity that we start where we live. And I recently wrote a very small little book called The Pocket Guide for Facing Down a Civil War. Surprising ideas from everyday people who stopped the cycles of violence. That was the experiences that I've had globally, but it's applied to our context here. So we come to the question, what can I do? I'm going to leave you with 3 ideas. And I'm going to try to place them in a way that hopefully you could imagine yourself actually remembering, if you will, remembering forward. So remembering in a way that as you experience moments that are difficult, these might come to you in a way that says, maybe this is the moment that I can try this. So idea number 1, how do you speak? If part of what we need is to understand that one part of our puzzle is the content that's very visible that we're fighting about, it could be around health issues, it could be around this election period, it could be around immigration, it could be around dozens of things that form the content of the arguments that we have. I mean, in organizations that I've certainly been a part of, it can be who got the office with the windows, who works more or less hours. Do doctors matter more than nurses? I mean, I don't have to go far probably to find a dozen ways that you can talk about content. What I'm going to refer to is underneath the visible content is the relational context, the quality of relationships that we have. Now, my view is that relationships are ongoing, and at any given moment, they have to be responsive to a new content rising, sort of like, you know, if you've ever planted them, a raspberry bush or a strawberry bush has this extraordinary part of its lively ecosystem that it pushes new plants up from the root system. So if you are growing raspberries and you cut them down, thinking I'm not going to let them grow here, they only get more powerful under the ground and they send new shoots back up. So let's imagine that our relational context is like the generative shoots underground, not as visible, but has the quality that can produce new energy. And that as we move across time, different issues will present at different times. And our challenge is both and. How to be creative about responding to what's emergent as an issue, but deeply cognizant of the quality of our presence with each other and our relationship that permits us to come to those issues in ways that do not destroy our relationships. So that's my basic thesis. Now, how to do that? 1, speak. I think it's important that we speak with each other, that we speak to our deepest held conviction, but that we do so without retreat or blame, and certainly without belittling other viewpoints. It's a little like how we might imagine, you know, that I have a dream moment. So if you, the famous speech nationally that Martin Luther King Jr. gave, that we could imagine as a tiny microcosm of what we're being asked for. Now imagine that in your work setting or wherever it is that you're working and engaging in your neighborhoods, that you are afforded the I have a dream moment, that you are going to speak to a sense of what you hope for that community, for your children, for your grandchildren, and for the quality of your relationships. And you're going to speak to the convictions that you feel have informed you through your life experience. In other words, as the Quakers put it, you're going to let your life speak. You're going to bring forward that which you feel, observe, and can propose. But you're going to do it without blame or retreat or belittling. Now, that is a first gift that can be made to offer how it is that you feel and see things in a way that is clear, but does not retreat away from nor does it blame and become, a projection that this is the only right way. It is you speaking from experience and from heart. This is why the word courage is built on the French word cœur, heart. To have courage is to have heart. You're offering something of your heart. Okay, that's one. Number two, imagine now that you're able, as other people who you know are different, push back with and from different experience, who may not agree and who may, in fact, find what you said, unacceptable, and confront. So what's the point two? Foster a non-defensive presence. Let me try to explain what I mean by that. This is about how you respond in the face of difference being expressed to you, and even in the face of confrontation. A non-defensive presence means that you will choose to interact with rather than react to. In fact, you might even be invitational. Please, I want to know, share with me your life experience. You're going to listen into the life experience. Now, let me just pose here a bit of tension between what polarization does to us and what I'm suggesting you do. Polarization says you're going to listen with your eyes. You're going to know that that person comes from group X, and you're going to stop listening because you're preparing your defense to what they're saying, right? Now, I'm saying, instead of listening with your eyes, do the St. Benedict thing. St. Benedict's first rule for the particular order that they had was to incline, that is to listen, with the ear of the heart. To listen into the lived experience and invite it. And part of what you're doing is that by taking a place that does not react but interacts, does not become defensive but reflective, is that you are creating and contributing to a pause of curiosity. A pause of curiosity that permits something to come forward that is not fully known. And you become curious about this. I think this has a lot to do with the practice of humanizing the face of conflict. That you see the person who you are with, not as a person who is adversarial to you, but a person who is a person first and has a lived experience that merits an exploration and an understanding. It is listening to understand. I also believe that it operates by way of the ethic of respect. Respect is such an interesting word. They made a whole song of it in the 60s, if you remember back to that decade, R-E-S-P-E-C-T, respect. There's a whole song that kind of lays this out. I don't know what your notion of respect is. Maybe it's something akin to the golden rule that you do unto others as you would wish is done unto you. I think what people most despise about the lack of respect is a sense that it is humiliation. That I'm not being listened to as somebody that merits anything, right? Respect in its Latin origin is built on the word to watch, specere. That's why spectator and respect actually have a relationship. A spectator is watching an event. So if you're specere, that is you're watching, you're looking, and here the tension with looking with, listening with your eyes, re-specere, means that you stop, pause, you stop, you turn, and you look again. You look a second time. Respecere, respect. I commit to looking a second time, to listening one step deeper, to asking about what the lived experience was that brought this person, who is a fellow traveler in this human life, to this place that they're at. Okay, now, those things, I think, it is very much about going straight at one of the core dynamics of toxic polarization. I worked with a group of campesinos in Colombia, overrun for decades by different militias and commanders, violent conflict, who, when they formed an effort to end those patterns of violence, set about with one very key guiding rule that they always operated by. I'd like for you to give some thought to whether you could do this in a context, in their case, that was quite violent. And that was this: we commit ourselves to understand those that do not understand us. We commit ourselves to understand those who do not understand us. Listening to understand is never easy in deep polarization, but it is among the most powerful of elements of how we rehumanize the face of what can easily go the direction of dehumanization. And I will say our dictionaries have a very clear definition of the word dehumanization, but I can find no dictionary that has a word for rehumanization. How do we make our way back to shared mutual humanity when we are this divided? Okay, so that's part of that too. Now, what's number three? Well, number three, stay with it. Stay in relationship, even when it gets tough. The pull of polarization will always push to separate, to move away from the pain of what's there. In many regards, staying with relationship means that these are never about one-time conversations. There will be a need to understand better and to continue together. There is a need to persevere against the tide of disengaging, to make, if you will, the complexity of difference a friend rather than a foe, to understand how significant it is that if we permit relationships to be frayed in the direction that they can easily go, we lose the fabric of what makes for a beloved, in the, again, the words of Martin Luther King Jr., a beloved community. A community that in essence cares about each other. And this was one of my big lessons, is that people who came through this in the hardest and most difficult of situations, I always found that they had the simplest of language for describing what they were doing. From the Rift Valley in Kenya, where interethnic conflicts were wicked, to Mindanao, where Catholic and Muslim conflicts were bad, to parts of India where Muslim-Hindu conflicts were bad. People working at everyday levels often described what they do as the very simple work of good neighborliness. Just being a good neighbor. And we don't fully recognize how quickly we can lose that fabric. So my three that I'll leave with you tonight. Speak from conviction and lived experience, but without belittling or defending or retreating or blaming. 1, 2, foster a non-defensive presence. Be open, be curious, invite difference, interact with rather than react to. When you find yourself defensive, choose to be reflective rather than defensive. These are the small habits of humanization. And 3, stay with it. I hate to make a big confession late in the talk, but here it is. I've never found that any election changed anything, really, of the things that we have to do together. It's not all miraculously going away. And in fact, this time through, it may be tougher. So we've got to have a fierce patience and a tender tenacity if we're going to make our way through this. And my basic understanding is start local, because that's where you have access. Take one step beyond your bubble of safety. Engage with people who are different. Choose to do it differently, that asks a bit more of you and asks more patience from you of how other people are coming at this, and stay with it. And if those things happen, it creates, I think, pockets of vitality that can make their way through not just polarization, but can bring and draw down the toxicity that we have to have if we are to protect this precious thing we have, I believe, in this country, which is a democracy of very diverse people who can find ways to be different, yet live together without violence and dehumanization. Now, I'm going to stop there, but I'm going to pose my 2 questions, and I'm going to turn it back to Deb because I can't wander around your tables. And my 2 questions are very simple. Around your table in groups of 2 or 3, I don't know how many numbers there are around each table, just talk with whoever you're sitting with in a group, no more than 3, of what either idea shocked you, caught you, resonated with you. Maybe you want to push back on one of those. Maybe you say, this is actually describing what I'm struggling with. And what's one question your group of 3 would have? We may not have more time than 1 or 2 of those this evening, but I think what's helpful is to learn your way into good questions that you together can carry into the places where you live and work. So over to you, Boise, Idaho. Thank you very much.
Is that supposed to be on? So what we're going to do is pass out some cards. Thank you, John Paul. We'll take about 10 or 15 minutes. We're going to pass out some cards and some questions. You help me? And we'll ask you to break into groups of 3 or 4, whatever's most convenient, and then answer those 2 questions. Basically, what surprised you, what shocked you, what did you feel was most relevant for you in the context of your life and work? And then what are your questions about how you're going to want to move forward? John Paul, am I articulating that properly? Yes? Okay. So I'm going to bring the questions around also, just in case you forget. Okay, so take a minute. I would say take a minute or 2 once you have the card to just answer that yourself. Put one answer on one side, one on the other, and then we'll open it up and talk to each other and see what you come up with. Okay, pass these out too. Yeah, thank you. Okay, so, hey, everybody. Oh, you know what? I need to, here, hold on. This works. That's so cool, right? That works so well. So Steve and I are going to walk around and we're going to ask if there's a group that would like to share kind of what you've come up with as far as what surprised you, what you found most relevant, and then also what is your question about how you move forward. And then we'll we'll have two groups talk and then bring that information back to John Paul, and then he can answer that, and then we'll go to two more. Okay? So anyone want to start? Yeah? No?
This is a chance to practice bringing your heart. You can't go wrong in a room like this. Okay.
Oh, yay.
We have a winner. I got you here. Okay. And
No, you're
the
the first.
rule here is bring it to essence. Right.
Oh,
In
I
other
don't
words-
know what you're talking
In
about.
other words,
But keep it, essence, distill it, distill it. Mine was that, what was most relevant to me is to be a good neighbor in my little neighborhood. We don't choose to live next to each other. And so we know there's differences by what signs we have in our yards, but doesn't mean that we still can't be good neighbors and have conversations. Is that essence enough?
that was great. Short and awesome, as we say in church.
Any question about how to
So my main question that came from this is how to interact with people who seem unwilling to interact with you. How to build that understanding when it kind of takes two people to build a connection, when two people, it has to take someone willing to share their story with you, knowing you're different than them, for you to be able to listen to it.
John Paul, do you want us to go to another table, or you want to take that first?
No, I think it'd be great to hear a little more around the room.
Okay.
Yeah.
Another group?
All right, Bill.
I think all of us at this table had a version of we only talk to each other. And so I think it's interesting. Our take was a little different. Your take was sort of, why don't those people listen to us? And I think our take was, why are we only talking to ourselves, right? A lot of us have been involved in various organizations that try to get at this, but we often talk to the same group of earnest, do-gooder people. And and like this room, right? We're preaching to the choir. So how do we get to people who don't think like us? And so we each had sort of versions of that reaction.
Wonderful. And what did you guys find surprising or most relevant?
That was the surprising and relevant. And we didn't get to the question because we were talking about the surprising and the relevant.
That works. Another group, one more,
All right.
before we bring it back to John Paul. Yeah?
Well, this is a question, and it's related to, I think, the questions that have already been posed, but how to show respect for views that seem to us to be disrespectful.
And anything in this table that you found most surprising or unusual or relevant to you?
Personally, I think the most difficult for me and most relevant is staying with it. It's exhausting and hard and sometimes overwhelming when it feels very personal. So how do you stay with it in those situations?
So you want to start there, John Paul? Or do you want me to, or do you want us to keep going around?
No, that's great.
Okay.
I'm happy to start here. They're spot on, observations and questions. Let me start by saying I have never found kind of a magic formula that's going to take care of it all. What I have found by somewhat careful observation over time in very different settings is that it takes creativity and it takes imagination of small risks. And most of the people that I've worked with sometimes have extraordinarily inspirational stories. And looking back, you wonder how they got through that long journey. And if you return to some of the early elements of it, it was always one small thing at a time. And the courage to start, basically. So to the specific questions, how to interact when it appears that there are people who are obviously unwilling. Don't expect willingness to happen quickly. For those who are very either resistant or have come to a place where they don't think that it's worth it, or that they're threatened by the very reaching out. The women of Wajir, it's a story I tell in a couple of books. They're very dear friends, live in a border area between Kenya and Somalia. And one way I titled their particular work, especially Deka Ibrahim and Nuria and a couple of them that were the originators, is how 6 women stopped a war. That's kind of an evocative title, just to say, when I listened to and engaged with how they thought about doing something, they had 2 things that became very clear. One was that the pattern had gone on too long. So one of the things I noticed that a few of you might be describing is it's exhausting, and we keep doing the same thing and it's not working. So that's kind of how they felt about it. It was like, this is not something that can keep repeating itself. So their way of describing what they did was they just sat with a few people to see what we knew. Very interesting little phrase. There's actually a video of these people. If you want to go to one or two of the resources that I could send on to Deb, there's a video of their conversation. We sat together to see what we knew. There's only a few of them. The second question was who we knew. Who we knew. And this to me is one of the things that I think that is the great, extraordinary gift of being local, is that typically we have some sense of a range of people, right? And what's, I think, interesting about that is we don't often do enough creative work around the who do we know and who knows who relationships that we actually have some access to. We often get paralyzed in part by imagining the more extreme versions as the ones that we can't imagine talking to, but we don't always imagine how to sit together with just a few. I tell students on campuses, for example, what a gift it is for them to move through classrooms, because every classroom is like a tiny microcosm, and they're going to hear somebody raising a question or saying something, And that will open up the potential that this person obviously is a bit different than me. And what if you had the possibility of trying to find that first small step? So there's a bit of a theory behind this to be clear about it. I call it the theory of the critical yeast, as opposed to the theory of the critical mass. Critical mass is misunderstood in physics, and I don't know, maybe in the room there'll be somebody who's a professor of physics that can clarify some of this. But the critical mass was originated in physics around atomic energy. And what it was trying to do was create an interaction between atomic material. And they were not looking at large amounts. It was very tiny. It's not visible even to the eye. But the interaction, the quality of interaction of the few became a critical mass when it had capacity to replicate energy independent of its originating catalyst. So energy independent of its originating catalyst. That was called the critical mass. We tend to use critical mass meaning it's not significant unless it's pretty big. And actually what I found is that, so I shifted over to critical yeast to get people to think more about it. It's like bread baking metaphor, right? So yeast is the smallest ingredient. So is there a possibility, and this probably relates to more than one of the questions, is there a possibility that you could find your way into conversation, not blocked by the unwillingness, but finding the points of access, the points of natural relationships where you have some form of regular contact and that you might just begin to sit together to see what you know about things you care about? The women of Wajir did not stop a war by initiating a massive disarmament program or a ceasefire or a political arrangement. They landed on one thing, and their one thing was, how do we make the market where we go safe for any person to buy or sell, no matter what subclan group they come from? So it's the strategies for unwillingness. There are a few that you might want to try, which is, I think, often unwillingness softens if there is offer of continued conversation and not reaction. But you can't obligate anyone to move toward you. Literally, the only thing that you have control over in the couple of these questions is yourself and how you open and react and respond. So I don't know what all avenues you all may be thinking of. I know that for some of you, you're in work settings where it's gotten complicated. Our wider healthcare system has gotten complicated in a variety of ways. For others of you, you may be connected to schools. For others of you, you may be connected to churches and forms of outreach programs. I think the questions that typically come should not stop you from starting. And the question might be, where might I start? Where might we start? And the whole notion of the critical yeast is that where there are a few unusual people who interact together differently, it has a quality of creating things that can be thought about and worked on that can create growth among a larger set. And so it's, I think part of the question would require me to be able to sit at your table with you for about 4 or 5 weekly sessions of coffee and tea till they're exhausted, to know where it is you're stuck. So since I can't come, find a couple of others to sit with you to think, where are we stuck? Why is it repeated? Why is it that the pattern is we only tend to talk with each other? What might shift that? Who do you know that is talking a bit differently with others? Who do you know that moves across conversations in an interesting way? Those are people that are enormous resources. A lot of places I worked, Take West Africa as an example, Liberia and Sierra Leone. These are civil war settings that were devastating. One of the things that continued to be a small potential was not connected to the field of peace building. It was connected to health. And that was that in a setting where violence was rampant, everybody needed access to health, but the hospitals no longer functioned and people couldn't travel them because it's too dangerous. So then a whole thing began, which was more like mobile clinics. Okay. And the mobile clinics were actually a small set of people that were traveling to different areas and in conversation with different sets of people. And that becomes an extraordinary kind of resource. And that was where a lot of the initiation of both social healing and peace building began, was by people taking notice of who was traveling around the landscape of the context of the conflict. So who are your little spiders? If you can't find a way to be one yourself, to just sit with a few people and ask, who is actually in conversation in interesting ways in our community? And what have they found that's working? So I would not beat your head against the brick wall of unwillingness. I would certainly stay open with curiosity when conversations emerge. I would stay certainly open to the patience that's required, that sometimes the small seed that you plant by the quality of your presence in the face of difference can come back later unexpectedly to seek you out. But because people notice when others afford them a form of care and respect, even when there is difference. So, I'm a haikuist, so I practice haiku on a daily basis. This little poetic practice of just taking notice of what's around you and trying to capture that extraordinary moment of awe in the simplest of terms. And I once wrote a haiku about seeds, and it goes like this: it's so dark in here. It's so dark in here. You can see me counting my haiku syllables, right? It's so dark in here. Something seeks the light of day. Something seeks the light of day, the life of a seed. So you don't need to applaud. It probably isn't coming across real clear. But let me just encourage you to imagine that even the smallest thing you do may actually be a seed, and the unwillingness rarely comes down with a one-time conversation or a one-time offer. But it may circulate back in ways. And look for people who are doing interesting things where you live. There was a third one, which was this idea of how to show respect when you feel you're being disrespected. And it kind of reverberates back to similar of what I was saying earlier. I think how you respond to it, though don't expect it to be any kind of formula. How you respond to it is a small contribution, the nudge in a system of disrespect. And it may not show itself immediately, but I think the ways that we choose to respond is one of the areas that we have available to us. And that over time, I truly believe that restitching some of the fabric of curiosity that we need across some of our differences is what creates the ability of holding these divisions from going further in a harmful direction. And that's, it's sort of that commitment that I think that we can make. It may seem very small, but it usually smallness has shown itself to be pretty powerful in the face of a lot of this kind of engagement. Deb, I'll defer to you. Do you want to take one or two more comments or questions? I probably have another 10 or 15 minutes before I need to attend to something here at home?
That would be great. That would be great. Mark, are you raising your hand?
How do you respond in this context that we've been talking about of peacemaking? How do you respond to this concept of justice? So there's if there's harm ongoing to other people, and so there's this thought of justice. How does that play into peacemaking and I guess the patience of peacemaking? And I guess the context I could put that into is like we're dealing with laws in Idaho that are hurting women. And so that becomes an issue of justice potentially. But you could also think about it in the context of race relationships within the United States and things like that, where there's these concept of justice.
Yeah. Well, it's a great question. So two things come to mind almost immediately. One is that we do live in contexts that have generations of what have been harmful patterns. So it isn't like we're automatically landing in a place of not being that it's coming up because somebody's pushing too hard or wants something that's not appropriate. It is that we have long legacies, often of things that have been harmful, and that past. There's a phrase from John Mbiti, one of the African philosophers. It's rather extraordinary, which captures some of the ways that indigenous languages often put the grammatical formation of past, present, and future. So I grew up with the message that the future lies before us. And John Mbiti grew up in a linguistic group where the inverse was the grammatical formation, the past that lies before us. And the understanding of that is that what we have lived is what we have seen. But what is to come, we don't actually stare at it. It's so we kind of have this oddity of walking into the future with our eyes on what has been the lived legacies. And I think the future question is, what legacy are we leaving, obviously, for the generations to come? So I'm a big proponent of the notions that justice, in its deepest and most significant understanding, is about right relationships, about finding ways for that in essence, it's ways to repair what has been harmed, but it is about an understanding that change is relationship centered. And that enduring change requires the restoration of our relationships that have been frayed and have been harmed. And that's work that takes time. My second thing that comes immediately was an early experience in the 1980s. My first real direct experience of being a part of a conciliation team that was moving between two sides of a civil war, Nicaragua, the Sandinista government, and the indigenous populations of the east coast of Nicaragua, a subset of a wider conflict that was happening. Those of you that recall that decade, it was a decade of very significant wars in Central America. The team that I worked with all of us were coming from a faith traditions, what I would call faith inspired. And the early meetings that were held in the first period where efforts were being done to bring forward conversations to end the open fighting, ceasefire, and to begin the process of building out a way that they could move forward without warfare. We held dozens and dozens of community meetings in local communities. And the team that I worked with always read Psalm 85 from the book of Psalms, in which there was this phrase, and they read it typically in Mestizo, which was an indigenous language, and they read it in Spanish in the old version of the Reina Valera, which is like our old a King James version in essence. That verse says, truth and mercy will meet together. Justice and peace will kiss. Now, I've worked 4.5 decades looking for the kiss because, man, is that a tough one. Because, if you just look at those four, because the writer in that old poetic way of writing, took a concept and made it into a person. Truth and mercy will meet together. It's like they're walking people and they're meeting together, truth and mercy. But just think about how complex it would be for truth and mercy to meet. Truth, which, especially in settings of deep and harmful conflict, truth is often posing the question, what happened? Who did what? What was the harm that has been lived here? It wants to shed light on what has been hidden and dark. It wants to that's why, in most of these places I've worked, they develop at some point in their process this notion of a truth commission, that there will be a public rendering and clarity brought to what has transpired here. So truth is often looking back to shed light on what has happened. And mercy, a lot of different translations for this, but mercy in its deepest concept from that context was about a new beginning. It's some form by which you're offering a new way to begin something when the harm has been done. Now, that's, if you will, forward looking. It's saying we're going to move from here forward. There's going to be a new way. So how do you get something that's looking toward the past and something that's looking toward the future to come together when their faces are pointed in the opposite direction, if in fact they are people? Or peace and justice. Justice is often saying there was harm done, what's the repair? There were things happening here, who recognizes and acknowledges it? Who will be accountable for what has happened? What are the ways that we need to work to restore and make this relationship right? It will require something to be done. And peace is often understood kind of in that direction that we're all just going to get along now. So those two people don't gather together easily. They don't kiss much, to be honest. And they're always suspicious of each other. Peace, if you ever had, so just imagine that I've run this exercise 100 times because I started thinking, what if you invited these four people into your room? Like this room tonight. What if truth and mercy and justice and peace showed up as four people and started talking to you all about Boise, Idaho? All right? Let's just imagine this for a moment. That these four people showed up and they started talking to you. What would each of them ask for? And who would be suspicious of who among the family of the four? Well, truth is not so certain of mercy because truth always gets covered up by people wanting to forgive and forget. Just get this thing over with. Let's move on. Let's get it done once, right? And truth is saying, well, you can't do that if you haven't even seen me. So don't start in on that until you've looked at carefully here. And mercy said, yeah, but if you do that, you're going to kill everybody before they even get started. Who's perfect among us? You can hear the arguments, can't you? I mean, so these are the social energies that show up in all these conflicts every time. And I think the challenge is not which one is more important. The challenge is how they're held together, how they're afforded space, acknowledgement and recognition that each brings something that is greater than the individual parts, and that none of them on their own can make any sense without the others if what we are, wanting to forge is the well-being and the healing of the human community. So that I say it just simply to say it's a fantastic question. It never goes away. And it requires us to listen for how and when those energies emerge and not act like we can ignore them, because if we do what we think is important, it will all be taken care of. It won't. Justice completely by itself can be a very sharp sword. And without other ways that it is held and complemented with ways that humanity is seen and respected, it also contributes in many situations in the name of justice, the very things that have repeated the harms, because as we all know, whoever wins something often carries the sword. So which justice in which way? These become deeply, challenging elements. So I think a lot of by my view, you will not have any really significant conversation whereby numerous of these social energy voices and people don't show up in them. That there will be people who are advocating for greater acknowledgement, and absolutely rightly so. There will be people who will want us to find ways to rehumanize who we are as a people and give each other a new opportunity. Absolutely, but not on its own. If it's a cover-up, it won't work. It will just simply come back up again. And so these are tensions, but they're tensions that I think are well worth holding together. We should not be afraid of meaningful conversations. And a conversation is not meaningful if it doesn't include some depth of really exploring who we are and what we've experienced in the human community. I don't know if that attends to what you were after, but I kind of got on my little rampage here.
So John Paul needs to leave us at about 8:15, and I think it's 8:14. So will you all join me in thanking him for this wonderful talk?
Yeah. Thank you all. I'm glad to be in touch. So I'll leave you only with these 3 words. Keep at it. Yeah.
Thank you so much. For all of you that are at the table, I just want to let you